What happens when fear of deportation meets an increasingly restrictive border? This week, we're seeing a dramatic surge that's reshaping migration patterns between the United States and Canada, and the numbers are absolutely staggering. Picture this: nearly 500,000 people in legal limbo, border crossings up 87%, and immigration lawyers reporting a 200% spike in desperate calls for help, all in just the past few months. This isn't just another policy story. This is a humanitarian crisis unfolding at the world's longest undefended border. If you're following immigration policy, planning to immigrate, have family affected by these changes, or you simply want to understand what's happening at one of North America's most critical border crossings, you absolutely need to hear this comprehensive breakdown. I'm your host here in InfoExpress, and this is your weekly migration update. And today we're going deep. Before we dive in, let me tell you what we're covering today. The shocking statistics driving this crisis, the specific policy changes that triggered this surge, real stories from the ground, Canada's strategic response, what this means for different communities, and most importantly, what's coming next. Let's start with the data that has immigration experts calling this unprecedented. The Canadian Border Services Agency processed 87% more refugee seekers between January and April, compared to the same period last year. But that's just the beginning of this story. In April alone, 494 people were turned back at the Canadian border under the Safe Third Country Agreement. To put that in perspective, that's up a staggering 76% from January's 280 rejections. We're talking about nearly 2,000 people being processed and turned away in just 4 months. But here's where it gets really interesting and concerning. The asylum claims processed by Canadian border agents jumped to 4,560 in April, up from 2,940 earlier in the year. That's not just a trend, that's a crisis-level surge that has both governments scrambling to respond. What's driving this unprecedented surge? It all traces back to a controversial and complex policy decision by the Trump administration on March 25th. The U.S. paused what's called the CHNV parole program, that's Colombia, Haiti, Nicaragua, and Venezuela, which had been offering 2-year protected status to certain refugees from these 4 countries. Now here's where this gets legally complicated and humanly devastating. An estimated 532,000 refugees from these 4 countries are now vulnerable to removal from the U.S. while a back-and-forth court battle continues. We saw a federal judge block Trump's order in April, leading to a temporary drop in border removals in May. But then the Supreme Court reversed that ruling on May 30th, triggering renewed fears of mass deportation. Dan Anson, Director General of Intelligence and Investigations for the CBSA, called this a major indicator towards potential migration flows northbound, specifically noting that these groups are likely targets of potential enforcement and removal operations in the U.S. Behind these statistics are real families making impossible decisions under unimaginable pressure. Toronto immigration lawyer Mario Bellissimo told investigators his office has seen around a 200% jump in inquiries just in the past week. That's not just calls, these are desperate families looking for any legal pathway to safety. But it's not just Toronto. Buffalo immigration lawyer Rosanna Berardi described the shifting legal restrictions in the U.S. for refugees as an emotional roller coaster, telling reporters that a lot of individuals will have to leave quickly and go elsewhere, and Canada would be the easiest place to go with respect to logistics. Here's the harsh reality these families are facing. Those who do attempt to flee north are hitting an increasingly fortified wall. Under the Canada-U.S. Safe Third Country Agreement, refugees must claim asylum in the first country they land in. This means refugees coming from the U.S. cannot claim asylum in Canada unless they have close family connections in the country. And if they try? Earlier this year, Investigative Post reported that U.S. Customs officials were holding migrants seeking asylum in Canada in makeshift cells at local bridge crossings, sometimes for days or weeks. Imagine fleeing violence in your home country, finding temporary safety in the U.S., then facing deportation and being held in detention simply for seeking safety across another border. Canada isn't just passively watching this crisis unfold. The government has implemented several significant policy adjustments this week that signal a more restrictive approach to immigration across the board. First, Settlement fund requirements jumped over 30% for both the rural community immigration pilot and the francophone community immigration pilot as of July 29. This means immigrants through these programs now need significantly more money in the bank to qualify, a move that could price out many potential immigrants from lower-income countries. Second, Canada is conducting consultations on its 2025 to 2027 immigration levels plan, with the government announcing plans to reduce temporary residents to just 5% of the total population by the end of 2026. This represents a major shift in Canada's immigration strategy. Third, in June, the Canadian government responded to what it called rising migration concerns with new measures designed to make the country's immigration and asylum systems more responsive to new and developing pressures. Among these steps are new ineligibility rules specifically designed to protect the asylum system against sudden increases. The message from Ottawa is crystal clear. Canada is proactively tightening controls in response to these migration pressures, even as humanitarian needs are increasing. To truly understand this migration surge, we need to look at why people are fleeing their home countries in the first place. This isn't just about U.S. immigration policy, it's about ongoing humanitarian crises that make return impossible for many. Let's start with Haiti. The country is facing unprecedented levels of armed gang violence, with gangs now controlling an estimated 60% of Port-au-Prince. Kate Swanson, an immigration expert at Dalhousie University, points out that Haitians in the U.S. are heavily incentivized to come north given this long-standing humanitarian crisis. As she put it, many of these individuals will look north for safety rather than face deportation back to the very conditions they fled. Venezuela continues to experience severe political repression and economic collapse that has created one of the world's largest refugee crises. We're talking about hyperinflation, food shortages, and systematic persecution of political opponents that has forced millions to flee their homeland. Cuba is dealing with an economic crisis that's been severely worsened by natural disasters and power grid failures that have, at times, left millions without electricity for days. When basic infrastructure fails repeatedly, people face impossible living conditions. And Nicaragua is experiencing both a multi-year drought that threatens food security and increasing political persecution. As University of Manitoba professor Laurie Wilkinson noted, with Nicaragua, people don't understand there's been a many years-long drought, and you either starve and die, or you pick up everything and walk through the Darien Gap and take your chances. For those trying to navigate this crisis, the legal pathways are becoming increasingly complex and restrictive. Let me break down what options actually exist for different groups of people. The Safe Third Country Agreement is the biggest barrier. This agreement between Canada and the U.S. means that refugee claimants are required to request refugee protection in the first safe country they arrive in. There are exceptions. If you have family in Canada, if you're an unaccompanied minor, or if you face the death penalty. But these exceptions are narrow. For regular immigration to Canada, the recent changes to settlement fund requirements mean that a single person now needs to show they have 15,960 Canadian dollars in settlement funds, up from around 12,300 just a few months ago. For a family of 4, you're looking at over $30,000 in required funds. The asylum process itself has become more complex, with new ineligibility rules designed to handle sudden increases in claims. This means longer wait times, more documentation requirements, and higher rejection rates for many applicants. What this means for different communities. This crisis affects different communities in vastly different ways, and it's important to understand these impacts individually. For Venezuelan communities in the U.S., many of whom have been living under temporary protection, the uncertainty is paralyzing. Families who have built lives, enrolled children in schools, and established businesses now face the possibility of being separated or forced to return to a country many fled years ago. Haitian communities face perhaps the most dire situation. With gang violence escalating and no end in sight to the political crisis, return to Haiti could literally mean life or death for many families. The community organizations I've spoken with describe this as an impossible choice between detention in the U.S. and potential death in Haiti. For Canadian communities, particularly those near border crossings, this surge is putting strain on local resources. Border cities are seeing increased processing times, temporary housing shortages, and overwhelmed legal aid services. Immigration lawyers and settlement services on both sides of the border are overwhelmed. The 200% increase in inquiries that Toronto lawyer Mario Bellissimo mentioned is being echoed by practitioners across the country. Wait times for legal consultations have stretched from days to weeks. Economic and social implications. Let's talk about the broader economic implications of this migration surge because this affects everyone, not just those directly involved in the immigration system. Canada's decision to reduce temporary residents to 5% of the population by 2026 will significantly impact labor markets, particularly in sectors that rely heavily on temporary foreign workers: agriculture, hospitality, healthcare support, and construction. This could mean labor shortages in key industries right when Canada needs workers most. The housing market implications are complex. While reducing immigration might ease some pressure on housing demand, the sudden nature of these changes creates uncertainty for both current temporary residents and potential immigrants who've already started the process. Social services are feeling the strain. Canadian cities near the border are reporting increased demand for emergency services, temporary housing, and interpretation services. These aren't budgeted expenses, and municipalities are struggling to meet the unexpected demand. International relations and diplomatic considerations. This migration crisis is also testing the diplomatic relationship between the US and Canada in ways we haven't seen in years. The Safe Third Country Agreement, which was supposed to manage orderly refugee processing, is instead creating a bottleneck that serves neither country's interests effectively. When US immigration policy changes rapidly, Canada has to respond quickly to manage the overflow. This reactive approach creates policy conflicts and implementation challenges that affect both countries' immigration systems. Border security cooperation remains strong, but the humanitarian aspects of this crisis are creating tension. Canada wants to maintain its international reputation for humanitarian leadership, while also managing domestic concerns about immigration levels and integration capacity. This story affects more than just those seeking asylum. It touches every aspect of North American society, from labor markets to foreign policy, from local community resources to international humanitarian obligations. Whether you're an immigrant, have family members navigating these complex systems, work in affected industries, or you're simply a citizen concerned about humanitarian issues and effective policy making, your voice and your vote matter in this conversation. If you found this comprehensive breakdown valuable and want to stay ahead of these rapidly evolving stories, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. We're one of the few channels providing this level of detailed analysis on North American immigration trends, and frankly, mainstream media often misses the nuanced policy connections that we dive deep into here. But here's where I really need your engagement. What questions do you have about immigration between the US and Canada? Are you personally affected by these policy changes? Do you work in immigration law settlement services or affected industries? Drop detailed comments below. I read every single one, and your questions directly shape our coverage and help us understand what matters most to our community. Also, check out our community tab, where I post quick updates between videos, share breaking news, and ask for your input on upcoming topics. This week I'll be posting a poll about which aspect of this crisis you want us to investigate more deeply. And if you want to support independent immigration journalism and help us do more in-depth investigations like this one, consider joining our channel membership or supporting us on Patreon. Links are in the description. Your support allows us to spend the time needed to really understand these complex issues instead of just reading headlines. As we wrap up this comprehensive look at this week's migration crisis, let's step back and see the bigger picture. This isn't just a story about policy changes or statistics, it's about the fundamental tension between national sovereignty and humanitarian responsibility, between orderly immigration systems and emergency human needs. We've covered a lot of ground today. 532,000 people in legal limbo, an 87% surge in Canadian border processing makeshift detention facilities, overwhelmed legal services, and policy responses that are reshaping immigration on both sides of the border. These numbers represent individual families, children, elderly parents, and people who've already survived incredible hardships just to reach North America. The legal battles will continue. Court challenges to the CHNV program suspension are ongoing. Canada's immigration-level consultations will conclude later this year, potentially reshaping immigration policy for the next 3 years. Border security measures will likely be adjusted as both governments try to balance humanitarian obligations with domestic political pressures. But here's what won't change in the short term: the crises driving people to migrate in the first place. Haiti's gang violence, Venezuela's economic collapse, Nicaragua's drought and political persecution, Cuba's infrastructure failures, these are not problems that will be solved by immigration policy alone. They require sustained international attention and coordinated humanitarian responses. What gives me hope in covering these stories week after week is seeing how communities respond. Immigration lawyers working around the clock, settlement agencies stretching resources to help newcomers, community organizations providing emergency support, and ordinary citizens advocating for humane policies. This crisis is bringing out both the best and the challenges in our immigration systems. Looking ahead, several key developments will shape this story in the coming weeks. Watch for the Supreme Court's next moves on the CHNV program, Canada's final decisions on immigration levels for 2025 to 2027, and potential bilateral discussions between the US and Canada about managing this crisis more effectively. I've been covering immigration policy for several years now, and what strikes me most about this current crisis is how quickly things can change. Policies that seemed stable can shift overnight, leaving hundreds of thousands of people in uncertainty. It's a reminder that immigration isn't just about laws and procedures, it's about human lives and the values we choose to uphold as societies. That's why this community we're building here matters so much. By staying informed, asking thoughtful questions, and engaging in respectful dialogue about these complex issues, we're contributing to better policymaking and more humane approaches to immigration challenges. The story we've covered today is still unfolding. The legal challenges, policy adjustments, and human impacts will continue to evolve. I'll be tracking every development, speaking with experts, and bringing you the analysis you need to understand not just what's happening, but why it matters and what might come next. Thank you for spending this time diving deep into this critical issue with me. Remember, staying informed is just the first step, but it's an essential one. Immigration policy affects all of us, whether directly or indirectly, and understanding these complexities helps us all be better citizens and advocates for effective, humane solutions. I'll see you next week for another deep dive into migration news. Until then, keep asking questions, keep learning, and keep caring about the human stories behind the headlines.